for
Yeah, exactly.
people are in
Second. It's not a- the University of Amsterdam, who describes herself as an anthropologist of health and technology and a science and technology studies scholar. She's affiliated with the Human Factor and New Technologies at Amsterdam Institute of Social Science Research and with the Center for Digital Anthropology at UCL. Her book, Calling Family Digital Technologies and the Making of Transnational Care Collectors, was published in 2023. This is it. Explores how digital technology shape family care at a distance when living in the same place is not the most feasible option. And I think partly drawing from the fieldwork in this book. Today she's going to tell us about reflect more on methodology, and the title is Field Events, Reconceptualizing the Field Through Research with Digital Technologies.
So thank you very much for this introduction and for having me here. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for coming here today. Indeed, the talk today draws on my fieldwork, which took place between 2013 and about 2020, or even more, on care at a distance and how people or family members who live in different countries around the world use everyday digital technologies like mobile phones and the internet to take care of each other at a distance. And specifically, I was focusing on elder care. So how people who migrate abroad, in this case, actually it was nurses who migrated abroad from Kerala, South India, how they use mobile phones, the smartphones, the internet to provide care to their aging parents in India. So I'll give you a little bit of background to this, and then we'll go into the history of fieldwork with digital technologies, how it developed a little bit, and I will share on this. I will share more about this because I do find it important to keep in mind that there is a history to technologies, right? So AI didn't appear all of a sudden in 2022. AI has a history of 50, 60 years. And it's the same with digital ethnography. It didn't just come up during COVID, during the pandemic, where everybody was requested to not do face-to-face fieldwork anymore, but it has a history of a couple of decades. So, and through that history, I mean, each and every step is important in some way and shapes what working with digital technologies is today as well. And then after that, I mean, I'll go through this part fairly quickly, hopefully, and then we'll go to the notion of field events, which I developed through my own research, precisely because I actually didn't find any of the other terms that I found in the literature quite the right terms to describe what I was doing or what was happening to me, both actually. So, and I think we have about 4 to 5 minutes, and then there will be questions, so you can write your questions down and then we can discuss them afterwards.
The sharing?
Well, it's sharing, but it's not moving. It's fine. Yeah. Right, indeed. So, so this is the book that came out of my fieldwork. It's also available open access. That's why there is the QR code. And there you can find, I mean, it's really an extensive overview of what I did and different parts. But essentially what I wanted to do with this book is to introduce the notion of transnational care collectives. And this book came out of my PhD fieldwork and also the fieldwork that I did afterwards, because I did some follow-up interviews and fieldwork also, especially because of the COVID pandemic. And I started out as an anthropologist, but at that time when I started, I actually found that there was no vocabulary within anthropology to work with technologies, with digital technologies, right? So, and there were very few theories on this. So I really struggled to find the right place for me. And I found it at the University of Amsterdam, where there was, and there still is, a nice interaction between anthropology and science and technology studies. So I took a couple of years to actually learn about science and technology studies and to see how that can inform how I approach care at a distance, how I approach technologies, and also how I approach the field site ultimately. Now, transnational care collectives, just very briefly, are what I call global assemblages of people and technologies which enact care together through practices such as frequent calling. So this is actually quite a different approach to care from what we are generally used to. So usually we talk about caring as in terms of caregiving and care receiving, right? And it's always, it concerns people. So people are at the center of care. And this is also very much rooted in the philosophy of care and the ethics of care, right? Where caring is one of the core characteristics of being a human, essentially. But what I realized is that we shouldn't really ignore the material environment and the technologies that are also a part of that. And actually, they can be a matter of life and death, right? I can go a little bit more in depth later on into this if you're interested. So I don't look at technologies as tools that people use to achieve certain needs, for example, a means of communication, but I look at them as agents that actually also shape how we relate to each other and how we care, and also what the meaning of care actually is. And science and technology studies help me to understand that in a specific way, because we really look at theories, SDS theories of care, look at understand care in terms of practice. So what is being done? What do people do together with technologies? It's not so much about emotions, for example, although I do write in the book also about the importance of affect, but it's really about the practices. And I found that one of the key care practices was actually calling when it came to transnational care collectives. And for calling to be considered a good care practice, it was supposed to be done frequently enough. And every transnational care collective had a different dynamic. So it was a little bit different based on who was involved. So the parents, the children, were there many siblings, where did the siblings live? Were there extended family members involved? Were there neighbors? And also what kind of technologies were involved. And this dynamic also changed not just on the basis of participants, but also through time. So if health became worse, if there was illness or accidents, and also for whom. It was not always just caring for elder parents, but it was sometimes also taking care of the children or even the grandchildren. And I started this research because I was actually really curious about the introduction of highly specialized technologies into healthcare in phenomena such as telemedicine. Are you familiar with telemedicine? By now, most people are. When I started talking about this, almost nobody was. So I think that the pandemic did a lot for this. But I was really surprised about 15 years ago when I had a chance to participate at some meetings where there were telemedicine projects being developed at the national level and even international levels. And I was surprised at the top-down approach. So there were people from the industry, there were people from academia, people from the government, but there was very little focus on what the people who would actually use these systems would really need. So the patients, the nurses, the doctors, the doctors and so on. So this whole project, I then designed it in a different way. I said, well, what if we don't go for this top-down approach, because a lot of those systems were actually failing at the implementation level. And I said, well, what if we turn this around and look at the everyday technologies that people are already using for the purposes of care, and how they support care or fail to support care, and how do they actually shape what care means, right? So as I said, I joined anthropology, which was especially useful because of the ethnographic approach, and science and technology studies, where I drew on the theories of material semiotics. So that's one specific theory within STS that was particularly useful. And as I said, I worked with Indian families of nurses who migrated abroad for work and their aging parents. No. Just very briefly, perhaps something that you might find some of the findings that you could find interesting. So to make it more concrete, one thing that I found was that in non-transnational families in India, good care is a very complex phenomenon, obviously, but some of the most important parts of it are really related to being together physically, right? So living together with the parents, so one of the children, usually one of the sons, either the oldest or the youngest, depends on where we are in India, or one of the sons and his wife live with the parents, and the wife would take care by providing food, so cooking and eating together and so on. And the son would provide financially, right? So that is the ideal. Of course, in practice, we have a lot of variation as well, but at least that's the ideal. But of course, when people don't live together anymore, that kind of good care is not possible anymore. So when I talked to people in India, some of them who did not have transnational families said, oh, you know, these people move to other countries and they abandon their parents. But actually what I found out was that not that they abandon their parents, but that they learn how to take care differently. So calling home frequently became a new kind of care, a new care practice. And this also had a specific impact on the daughters, because for daughters in India also, often the most important thing to do most important filial obligation is to get married, right? And with that, ideally, so I'm talking about the ideal image here, her obligations towards her parents would cease, because then her obligations would be with parents-in-law, right? But with these families, where the daughters became nurses, the filial obligations changed. It was not about getting married as soon as possible, at the age of 18 or 19 and so. It was about first becoming a nurse, then migrating abroad, preferably to an English-speaking country. Then once there, sending remittances back home and also calling regularly and visiting frequently. So there's a whole shift of what it means to be a good doctor. And with that also, there was a shift of what it means to be a good son and a good son-in-law, right? So if you want to know more about that, there's you cannot really see it right now, but there's an article, Shifting Duties, specifically focusing on this. Now, to do this research, I initially imagined my research as a multi-sided fieldwork. I said, well, obviously I will go to India because I will be working with Indian families and especially elder people staying there. But I also wanted to follow some of the nurses who migrated abroad. And these nurses, they have been migrating since 1950s, basically all around the world. They first went to the US. There's a long history of migration with the Middle East. But then later on, they also started migrating to the European countries, to Australia, they're everywhere, South Africa, the Maldives, you name it. But of course, I wasn't able to follow them all around the world, right? I mean, this would be very intense in terms of resources. So I said, well, among all of those, I chose Oman because I thought, well, there's not really much known within anthropology about Oman. And there's also quite a long historical relationship between India and Oman. And there were lots of nurses there. And I said, so this will be my two sites. But then, so do you recognize these words? Imagine yourself suddenly sat down.
Yes.
Yes. Anybody else? Yes, no? Yes? Where does this come from?
I think that's Malinowski.
Yes. What is it? Malinowski?
It's the beginning of the Gauguins.
Yes. So Malinowski is the founding father of ethnography, right? Of the ethnographic method where you go somewhere very far away for a long, extensive period of time, preferably an island, like you did, right? And then you stay there and you research that community in a very spatially and temporally delineated way, right? So this was me going to Kerala. Well, not me, but this is a picture of where I was in central Kerala. And this is actually me there in Oman. This is where I went physically, right? And you can already see that there were very different environments. So you can see there was a lot of, the green of Kerala, also the humidity of the atmosphere, also a specific kind of food and the traffic and all of that. It gives you a specific kind of being in the field, right? And then in Oman, it was a very different picture. A very dry environment, a very different way of living, right? Because in India, I was told, well, when it gets dark, women especially should go in, like, you don't wander around at night. In Oman, I came there and I was like, God, I shouldn't go out at night. But then after some time, I realized that everybody does just that. Like nobody goes out in the sun. Obviously, it's too hot. So they go out at night and there was life only after 8 p.m., and so it was a very different experience of being in the two countries. But then something else happened. So this is still Malinowski. Imagine yourself suddenly sat down, surrounded by all your gear, alone on a tropical beach close to native village. And this is then what happened to me. I was in India. It was about a week or 10 days into my fieldwork, and I was visiting a family. There were the father, the mother, and one of the 3 daughters who lived together in Kerala. And 2 older daughters were already nurses living and working in the UK. And so I stayed there also overnight. So I was there for a few days. And it was a very intensive day. We already had dinner. It was 10, 11 o'clock at night. And I thought, well, this is it. We're wrapping up. But then all of a sudden we hear this noise in the computer. And it was the son-in-law from the UK calling on Skype. And then the daughter in Kerala jumped up and of course she wanted to talk to him. And then she chatted a little bit. And of course the main thing to say was that they have a visitor. And she sat me in front of the computer and she said, here, talk to him. And all of a sudden, I found myself carrying out an interview with this person in the UK, right? And what do you do as a field worker? I think a good field worker goes with the flow, right? So whatever is presented to you, if it is related to what you're doing, I would go with that. Because then also this question popped up. Am I only going to focus on nurses who live in Oman? Or am I also going to include those nurses who live in other countries? And indeed, this was just the first event out of many that happened and that I didn't plan on. But, I was just invited to talk to this nurse, a daughter who worked in the Maldives, or talk to the daughter who was in Canada and her family and so on. And I said, well, I'm not going to limit myself. It actually also turned out to be quite difficult to find families with nurses, especially in Oman, at least in the location where I was in Kerala. So I said, I'm just going to include everything. But then when I came back to academia and I was giving presentations about this initial periods of fieldwork, people would ask me, so where's your field site? And all of a sudden, I didn't really know what to say. Because of course, my field site was in India and it was in Oman. That was clear because I was there physically. But what about all those other sites where I had data from, but I didn't visit in person? And then also keeping in mind that all the people who lived in those different countries, their experience was very different from each other, right? They lived in different atmospheres, in different environments, they ate different food, they were subject to different immigrant regulations. They were subject to different salaries and work conditions, and they had different possibilities of returning back home and so on. So all these different geographical locations actually had a different impact also on transnational care collectives, right? And I still didn't know how to describe my field site. What was it? So these are all the different countries where the nurses that I included in my research lived. So the green ones are the countries where I actually physically went. Actually, it was not just Oman, also what's next to?
UAE.
Yes, exactly, thank you. And then all the others, the blue ones, I didn't visit in person, but I was in contact with nurses through different kinds of digital technologies, because that matters as well. So with some of them I spoke only on the phone, with some of them I spoke on WhatsApp, I exchanged messages, I exchanged text messages and audio messages, and even PDF files of their wedding albums, for example. And with others I had Skype interviews or Facebook Messenger interviews and so on. And that I found mattered as well. So where's my field site? Still don't know. So I went into the literature trying to find out if there is an expression, a concept, a notion that would help me describe this field site. What was I doing? And I found all these different terms that were related to ethnography, and they're still, some of them are pretty new, some of them more than others, and we'll go quickly through them. I'll try. So cyber ethnography, virtual ethnography, net ethnography, digital ethnography, online ethnography, and now the most recent data ethnography. Are you familiar with any of those? Yeah? Which ones do you know? Or do you use perhaps yourself? Digital ethnography? Anything else? Cyber ethnography? Virtual also? Yeah.
Data, there's a great hummus one about data flowing to the Solomon Island. Very good. Yeah.
Interesting. Want to hear more about that. So one of the earliest terms, so two of the earliest terms were ethnography and cyber ethnography. And that actually came out of course, the beginning of the internet, but also these terms originated in more applied ethnography, and specifically in market research. Right? So the early cyber ethnography ethnographers focused on, for example, forums, online forums, and they still treated them as kind of closed sites, social sites, right? Where they could read what people were discussing, and they were mostly focusing on the text. So at that time there was little other interaction, but the text was what they were collecting, kind of data. Then later on, in about I think it was about 2000, then the internet developed further, and there were many more images starting to appear online. So again, this was for applied ethnography, or applied anthropology and marketing research, where the ethnographers would look, observe, and collect images that people posted online. So there was a platform, Flickr. Does anybody know that still? Yeah, I don't know. Does it still exist? Yes. Yeah, it does. So for example, what's in your fridge? And that was very interesting, of course, for manufacturers of fridges. So it was about following different hashtags. And here it was again about observing the behaviors. So what did people post? What did they exchange and so on? But there was less direct interaction. So it was a kind of lurking also. And here, so it was not just about the text, but now we also have the images, photos and videos. And then online ethnography was started to appear in academic research as well. So Christina, hi. She was one of the first to write about the online ethnography. And she also wrote about the internet event. So she said, well, you can follow an event online by looking at everything that is published about an event online. So news pieces or whatever people posted, then not even on social media, but whatever was discussed in whatever kind of way online, okay? But in general, this was still a lot about the transfer of traditional ethnographic methods into a digital context. So in the sense that, okay, we have an interview here right now in person, and then let's try to have the same interview online as well. So Skype interviews, online surveys, participant observations on discussion boards, informant recruiting through the internet. And there were several positive aspects that were being promoted. So for example, it was faster, it was simpler and less expensive than traditional ethnography because you didn't have to travel, you didn't have to adjust to a new environment, you didn't have to spend the money on housing and so on. And that, of course, was also specifically important for women that were anthropologists in the academic world. So it was a sort of also a survival strategy, right? Especially for the academics who got children and then all of a sudden realized that it's not so easy anymore to go to a different part of the world and do the traditional kind of fieldwork anymore. But at this time, this kind of ethnography was still very much on the fringes of the discipline. It was definitely, it was something that was more and more that people were kind of arguing for. But in the mainstream, from what I observed and from what I read, it was not the mainstream at all, right? What I also find interesting and important to mention is that there was this argument, you know, to push for to make it as real as the real ethnography, the argument of mechanical objectivity, in the sense that if we are just observing data online, we're not intervening, and that makes it much more objective. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, but I want to mention this especially because I really struggle with this human tendency to place that much trust in technologies, and also, you know, also in, that's from a different field, but also in numbers, right? We have this very interesting tendency to believe that something that comes from numbers and something that comes from the technology is more objective than if it comes from people, from the, sorry? Yes, no?
Same, I said the same.
Yeah. Right. So in 2008, this book came out, Coming of Age in Second Life. So this book was by Tom Booster, you probably know, right? So this was about studying virtual worlds. So it was really, again, the next step in engaging with the digital. But even here, the second world was a social side that was really virtual, that was online, right? So it was a bit spectacular in the sense that not everybody engages with that all the time, right? Some people do, but in a sense it was still very special. But it started this discussion of breaking the distinction between the online and offline, between the online as kind of not very real and the offline as the real interaction. And we still have that. When we speak, we have that, well, in person is more real than what happened online. But here already, this idea started to appear that what happens online can actually have very real consequences also in a non-online world, right? And if you've seen the Adolescents on Netflix, right, that is a very concrete example of how this can happen. And finally, I want to mention very quickly the data ethnography, because this is something that's very new, and this kind of ethnography has more to do with how data becomes, how is it made, and also the materiality of it. So if you look at the Atlas of AI, you know perhaps that book, yeah? I hear that Kate Crawford is actually coming to speak on the materialities of the AI next week in London.
Yeah, Queen Mary's.
Yeah.
It's gonna be great.
So I think, yeah, if you can, it should be a nice event, I guess. So this is about demystifying AI by looking behind the technology. So what are the environmental costs? What are the labor costs? And also, what does it mean? What are the costs of translating the real world into data through classification? And finally, digital ethnography, which most of you know or are most familiar with. And that was actually also the closest to what I was doing, except that I still didn't find the way to approach the field site, even through digital ethnography, right? So this makes the next step in the sense that it moves from spectacular worlds such as Second Life into the everyday world, right? So looking at digital technologies as something that happens in our everyday interaction, and is not something spectacular or special anymore. And what Sarah Pink also says is, well, we really should focus on the research question and through that see how it relates to digital methods. Because you can also take the other way around and say, oh, I'm going to study this particular digital environment and I'm going to adapt my method to that, right? But she says the research question should guide and then see what kind of digital technologies are related and relevant to the research question. She also talks in some other work on visual space events, and that is an idea based on spatiotemporal events by Dorian Maxey, who's a human geographer, right? So this is where the literature that I was reading that led me to the idea of events. Now, when I did, as I said, I joined anthropology with science and technology studies. I was already studying care through this theory of material semiotics, which looks at people as agents, but also technologies as agents, rather than as tools. And I said, wow, actually, this is also relevant to what I'm doing in terms of methods. And so I came up with this notion of field events, and I write about this in a paper I published together with my colleague Van Lee, because she had some fascinating data from her own fieldwork. I'll talk about that later as well. And the idea of field events, the word events, is really to shift the focus from the field as something that is situated either in a geographic or in social spaces. A site, right? A space is how we describe a site. So whether physical or digital or virtual. And this is, I think, an important distinction because George Marcus already talked about the multi-sited fieldwork in the sense that you can move between different sites, not only geographical, but also social spaces. So you can move, for example, from a policy institute and a healthcare clinic and a newspaper as a site and so on. But I want to make this shift into an event as something that also recognizes the dimension of time. Okay? And the important thing is that fields events are a collection, so fields then becomes a collection of events that are co-created within specific practices by ethnographers and their interlocutors and the different kinds of ICT, so information and communication technologies, or digital technologies. And just last week, a version of that paper was also published in an edited volume, Qualitative Methods for, now I can't see exactly what it's. Right, Qualitative Methods for Digital Social Research, and those are studies from the Global South.
You can hide that completely if you want.
Oh.
That's better, yeah, sorry.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you. Now, let's go into field events a bit more. So I heard that Daniel Miller was here talking about his work, and I've been, we've been exchanging ideas over the years as well. So his first series with him and his colleagues, Why We Post, is sort of a typical anthropological approach to digital technologies, because it's really asking not how technologies change us or what we do, but really how people change the technologies that they use, right? And I have exactly a different approach in the sense that I look at, well, what do technologies also do to us? Okay? And the important thing is that there actually is no such thing as technology. There are only different kinds of technologies, and all of them have different affordances, so they allow us to do different things, and therefore they impact us in different ways. And those can be very, very slight differences, but they can have important impacts. Even in terms of the internet, right? So Ahlin and Miller write about the polymedia environment. So there are different sites. You're familiar with this, I can imagine. So Snapchat and TikTok would be more personal news, but LinkedIn, Video and Sing would be more for professional use, right? And also, these are very country specific as well. Some are used more in, where is it? So Line, for example, is used mostly in Japan. Sing is used in German-speaking countries and so on. Now, what you can also do when you use digital technologies, that you collect different kinds of images. So what my interlocutors did was that they sent or shared with me the images that they circulated on their WhatsApp. So for example, these two images were shared by a nurse who lived in Oman, and should I translate them? So they're in Malayalam. I don't speak Malayalam, but I had translators for that. And they were actually, this kind of images were very important for me to understand the discourse of abandonment. When people talked about nurses living and abandoning their parents. So here, this image says, here's a son, and the son says, come, father, come with me to, it's either in the US or Dubai, come with me to Dubai. And the wife says, and so at least we'll have somebody who will clean our house. And on the other hand, you have the other son that says, come live with me, come mother, come with me to the US. And his wife says, so at least we'll have somebody who takes care of our children. And the couple says, oh, better we go to an old age home, at least then we can be together. Which is not something that older people in India would do. So, this was really how they only go to old age homes because they're so disappointed by their children, and their children are just thinking of themselves, and they're so materialistic and so on. So that was a part of this discourse. And so was this image. Here you have a very poor family, and they pray, oh God, please let at least one of our children move abroad. And then, so they would send remittances back home. And then that does happen. But then you have the old lady who lives by herself. And she has a huge house and a new car. And she says, oh God, please let at least one of our children come back so somebody will give me a glass of water, right? So there's again this emphasis that, the children go, but the old people need somebody physically to help them and to give them a glass of water, and they're lonely and depressed. What I found with these images though, was that it was impossible to find the authors. So I couldn't include them in my book. And this one, the meme, this meme is actually a composite of many images. And again, I wasn't able to find the authors. So for copyrights, I wasn't able to include them in the book. But you can also engage people with digital technologies quite a bit. So this is where my colleagues Fang Li's work comes in. So she did a digital diary with her interlocutors. She studied young people who travel a lot between China and Taiwan for work and for studies, but a lot move all the time. And she studied there the diets. So behavior related to food and eating. And for some time she did follow them. She actually went to the bus with them, but then she found out that that was too taxing for her. So what she did was she asked some of those people with whom she established good relations, and she said, well, she asked them to take pictures of anything that's related to their eating habits, either shopping or preparing food or eating food, and then share those pictures with her through whatever platform they wanted. And it proved to be a great method for her because also this research was in Asia, where people really love to take pictures of food and share pictures of food. And she received enormous amounts of these images. And at some point she said, well, actually, I have enough, so you don't need to send this anymore. But people wouldn't listen. So they just kept sending her images for over 2 years. She collected data for 2 years, and then she said, I cannot do that anymore. So I will just not count this as data anymore. Right? So she really had to set the limit, make a decision about what you will count and what not. I'll skip this one. This is from my field work, and it's actually about how certain technologies, because they are visual technologies, actually expand transnational care collectives. But I'll leave this. So the digital technologies can help you engage participants in many different ways, right? You can ask them to write diaries in a Google Doc, which becomes a live document. You can ask them to do a digital diary like Fang did. You can ask them to record video clips on smartphones and share that. Or to ask people to have the webcam on and follow them in real time. And then you can have ride-alongs and eat-alongs and dance-alongs and so on. Or you can ask them to send photos and then also use those photos for a conversation. So this is at the same time collecting data and also using the data to talk about what people were doing, right? Which is also how photo voice is used. I'll skip this. So this is a longer note from Fang's fieldwork, where she talks about what happened when she was trying to contact one of her interlocutors. So she was trying to follow up with Kevin, who worked as a storage assistant for a shipping company, but the company didn't allow him to use his personal phone during work hours. So it was almost 8 p.m. in Singapore, 2 p.m. Amsterdam time. And she's been waiting for Kevin to come online since 5, because that's where they planned the interview, but he didn't show up. And this was not the first time she experienced this. So she was waiting and she was wondering what happened. She checked her messages. She found no messages from him. She checked the time difference again. Did she get something wrong? And then she checked the last conversation from a few weeks ago. So did she really schedule this at this time? And she waited for him for hours and he didn't show up. So why is this important? There's actually several things that happen here. One is that there are larger infrastructures that are shaping field events. And these are not just physical infrastructures, so communication, cables, what kind of technologies are available. That all differs from one country to another. And in Oman, for example, where I was, this changed very frequently because the rules about which kind of networks were allowed for communication changed. And sometimes they were prohibited and some were not. So people were switching a lot and trying to find out what works and what not. And they also weren't sometimes sure if they're doing something wrong and can actually be punished for that or not. So there was also some precarity in there as well. But for Fang, this also had to do with the infrastructure of the workplace, where there were rules about what kind of technologies were allowed and what not. And of course, you also see the time, right? So scheduling, when is it a good time, taking into account the time difference. So The infrastructures that I mentioned are important because they are kind of absent present. So that is an expression that comes from science and technology studies, and it refers to that which is not immediately visible, but is crucial for the functioning of technology. So when we work on our laptops or smartphones, we don't usually think about all the cables that run under the ocean, right? We don't think about all the electricity that is so important, as we recently saw with what happened in Spain and Portugal, right? But these infrastructures are key to the functioning of technologies, and that shapes the field events. And for my study, of course, it shaped the transnational care collectives as well. And I also indicated the importance of time, right? So when you're trying to set up field events with interlocutors, you have to manage different time zones and different schedules, and that the schedules are always a question, right? Even if you are doing a face-to-face field work, you always have to manage people's personal schedules and work schedules and so on. But when there's also a time difference involved, this becomes even more complicated and sometimes even additionally frustrating. I definitely have to mention the distinction between synchronous and asynchronous communication. So synchronous happens at the same time. Having live conversations, either in text or through the webcam. And here, Ray writes about, there's a beautiful paper about using digital technologies to follow protests. That's her example, because then you cannot really be sometimes physically present even in such situations. So she was studying protests in Russia, and she found that actually it was not so much about being there physically, but about being there, present at the same time. Because she had this very strange experience, similar to what I had actually, of being very intensely focused on what was happening online, through the videos that she was receiving, through live recordings of what was happening, through switching between different accounts and different recordings. And she was so focused on that she was really not so much in her physical environment anymore, right? So it's really about switching the attention. So it becomes very embodied and it becomes being present in that moment. And asynchronous is of course with a time difference, and that can be convenient or not. And this can also help you manage the relationship you have with your interlocutors, because the more frequently you will be in touch with them, the closer the relationship. That's the same with care. The more frequent the interaction, the better care. And if you want to make a little distance, then you start spacing out the interactions, right? And this also brings us to one of the last points, which is the time of fieldwork. So both for me and for Frank, it was very clear when the fieldwork started. It started with the flight tickets. It was printed on our flight tickets. This is the day we went to the field, but it never ended. It's the ending was much more fuzzy. It did not end with us coming back to our point of start, say, to our universities, right? Because for Fun, people kept sending her photos, and for me, I kept doing the interviews for years. And I stayed in touch with my interlocutors also on WhatsApp or on Facebook. And that really makes it very difficult to say, oh, this is the end of fieldwork. So both Fang and I, we decided quite consciously that we have to cut this network, that we have to make a decision when we will not count something as fieldwork data anymore. And then the relationships can continue, right? But then you kind of disengage from those relationships as a researcher. So to keep the personal touch in field events, I think that frequency really matters. So when the pandemic started, and all of the research had to move online, also for students, right? For master students, for example, this was a big shift. And I remember having these conversations at our department, where they suddenly didn't talk about fieldwork anymore, but they talked about fieldwork in terms of interviews. So when you move the fieldwork in person online, it suddenly becomes about how many interviews do I have to have good fieldwork. So there's this danger of flattening fieldwork to interviews. And I think what really matters then is the frequency again. So it's a very different thing if you set up a one-off interview with a person, or if you set up a weekly tea online with somebody. So some of my colleagues were doing research with older people during the pandemic. And they said, oh, you know, we were meeting every Friday at 9, and you know, I came with my cup of coffee, and the lady came with her tea. And then after the regulations were not so strict anymore, I actually went to see that lady in person, and it was like we were friends. But they were meeting for the first time in person, right? So the frequency of meeting does something for the relationship. And I do think that doing field work the old way, by actually visiting, really matters still. So, you know, some people have asked me when I was talking about this, they said, oh, you know, so does that mean, because if this clearly works and we can get data and we can do research, does it mean that we don't have to do in-person field work anymore? And I would say, no, not really, because that gives you different kinds of information. So it really is about thinking about how do these different technologies shape our relationships with the interlocutors? How do they shape the data that we receive? What kind of data we receive? And how does that shape the whole research then, both the relationship and the research? And even when it comes, so when I think about caring at a distance, the nurses who lived abroad, the children, they would never say, oh, it's enough that I just call. It was really important to also visit the parents. And even if it happened once a year, or maybe once in 2 years, if that was the only option in terms of finances, that was important to do. So, so there was always this component, right? It was never just, oh, it's fine, I'm calling them and that's enough. It wasn't. There had to be a combination. So this is my final slide. I think finally we are still left with this question of what is good field work when it's done with digital technologies. So what are the new norms of field work? I think it's important to think about which human and non-human actors participate in the creation of field events, how and under what conditions and with what consequences, both for the data and for the relationships with the interlocutors, right? And you know, I still wonder, you know, when you think about the field events, does it mean that you have to have a certain amount of field events and that would make a good field work, right? I don't think that's an answer. I think it's really about when do you feel that you have kind of saturated your field, when you have gathered enough data and so on. But this is, I think, an ongoing conversation that's going to be increasingly complex, actually, as new technologies emerge. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great, well, thanks for a very stimulating paper, which has helped us navigate our way through this minefield of digital related research. I'm sure there are many questions, so I'd like to go ahead and just open it up for people's questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for a very interesting lecture. I'm working with criminal innovation and particularly how sex trafficking has migrated to social media platforms. And that's, so what I'm particularly interested in, what you talked about, is this idea of the offline, like we think of the offline as not real. No, the offline is real and the online is the artificial space. But what you're saying is that what happens online, we have to recognize that can create and have offline consequences. And I'm conceptualizing right now the idea of how the online structures have an effect of how people operate within them. So how do the criminals, what are their behavioral strategies based on the design of the platforms themselves? And based on how the victims are operating. So this is becoming very long, sorry for that. My question to you is whether you have any thoughts on this, because you're talking a lot about interviewing people, and I get that that's a physical person that you're interviewing online. But for me, it's not that I can't interview people physically, it's that the subject of which we're talking is online. It's cyberspace is the whole thing. That's the field, you know?
So what is your question?
So my question is like, do you have any insights on that, or like kind of, yeah, engaging in cyberspace as the field itself and not just as a tool to get in touch with your subjects?
Yeah, I think this speaks very much to the idea that the distinction is completely blurred by now. I mean, I showed this historical progression because it also goes together with the technologies, right? And I think what we are living in, all of us right now, is a blur. And that it is important. So, you know, for a long time, researchers only looked at what happened online, right? So, for example, if you only looked at the subject, so is it sex trafficking or?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you looked at that only without talking to the people who are involved in this, who are creating those platforms and so on. So I think there's a combination of an important combination of both, engaging with both, so studying the digital websites and the people who are involved with them. And I think it's important also to keep in mind that there's a lot of psychology behind the creation of the internet and the platforms that is probably shaping us on a physical level in terms of how we think. And maybe that would be also something to look into. For example, Addiction by Design by Natasha Schüler, I think. Yeah. That could be relevant also if that is, because there is also increasing literature, I think, on the internet stimulating pornography. So how does it impact people in the field of pornography, which is related to your field, right? I just read recently an article on this, I think it was in The Guardian, on how people are physically changing and changing their behavior because of those websites. So,
Do you remember?
I can look it up, and if you write to me, I will find it, yeah. I can share it, yeah.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. My question is that you were there in India. So have you combined this methodology that doing some digital anthropology at the same time you were participating in this society and observing, and how, because you have this stress that what you doing in the with this online and the digital stuff, but what about this, how this helps or how it complements this real observation of you, or what you were doing, and how with this methodology, or is it a combination, or you think that it's like digital ethnography what you were doing?
No, it's definitely a combination. Yes, I mean, the field events here are about really those events where I engaged with nurses through the technologies. But I was also there and also talking both to parents and to their children. So it was, the field events were sort of complementing the traditional work for me, right? But they were essential. So for me, it was also true participant observation, because I kind of lived what the people were living through these interviews, right? I lived through the poor connections and cut cables and the problems of not knowing which platform to use and is it safe, and VPN and so on. So, so I was really invited into this by my field, by my interlocutors. And that is also what Sarah Payne says essentially, that your research questions should guide your engagement with the digital as well. Right? And in this sense, I think it's important to follow the people. So even if you ask people to share with you certain data, it's usually, in my experience and from what I've read, it's a good idea to follow them. So not tell them, oh, please use this platform, but to follow what they use. Let's say, and you as an ethnographer, you then have to learn those, how to use those digital technologies, right? So it's also, I find, a certain, a new form of language that we are required sometimes to use, to learn. And so, you know, and they're all, we talk about digital literacy, for example.
Yes.
But digital literacy is also an impossible goal to reach for all of us because the technologies change so fast. So it is about something that is evolving and that you do as much as you can, right? But also the people you're working with are probably the same. They're also evolving in that sense. Does that make sense? Or do you have more
Yes,
thoughts?
thank you. I will ask more time later. But
I just had a question about, I love the idea of, in one bit when you talked about the field event, you talked about them only existing in kind of co-creation. And I was just curious about, like, I guess, as opposed to the kind of mechanical objectivity, it sounds to me like there's a kind of mechanical subjectivity or mechanical like reflexivity in that, like, these events only exist, that the event is kind of created through your participation. And I guess I'd be interested to know a bit more about, like, how you distinguish between I guess the contemporaneous field event versus if you're able to share your data, say, and I was to, well, let's say one of your interactions was recorded and someone watched it later. I was just thinking about the protest in Russia, and some of these things leave digital footprints, albeit like like partial ones. And I guess, how does the field event fit within, I guess, the lurking or the online? How does the kind of your subjectivity as a researcher fit into that?
Yeah.
It's a very garbled question, I'm sorry.
I'm trying, thank you, trying to find the gist.
Yeah.
But I think
I was too.
if I'm reading it, if I understand it well, what you're saying is, so what is different from lurking and observing, what is different is that the interlocutors are also actively involved in the shaping, right? So just to give you an example, the different people I talked to or interacted with, they have different preferences on how they want to interact with me and which kind of technologies they want to use. And it was very interesting that this was also gendered. So for example, it was much easier for me to actually talk to women in person and to find that they were very engaged and would share a lot with me in person. But when I tried to follow up with them online, that was much more difficult. And it was sometimes impossible. So sometimes I tried to reach people that would share a lot with me, that would invite me to their homes and introduce me to their family. But then I reached out to them online years later on Facebook, and they were like, yes, yes. And then they would not respond at all. So that was with women mostly. But with men, it was the other way around. So the men were very happy to engage with me online and to have this lengthy 2-hour-long conversations. So I don't know what exactly, I mean, what makes for that difference. I think it has to do something with privacy as well, with, you know, what is perceived the private space and the public space and so on. So I think there's also this, it's a very different engagement than just collecting data that is online and, you know, that you can, I don't know, scrape and then use in your, in your, as your research data.
Can I add something on that and it's connected, sorry?
Maybe it'll make sense of what I was trying to say.
Sorry, because I'm not English speaker and I try to do my best, but I was doing fieldwork in bodily self-harm communities. Well, first of all, I did my fieldwork in a mental health institution. And while I was interviewing the adolescents, they said me that there were spaces, online spaces, where they find themselves. So I tried to find these virtual spaces and I found it and I started to follow the information that was there. And at that point, I had to take some decisions or to take some decisions. First decision is, can I take this information as a lurker, for example, or the girls, because maybe they are women, have to know that I'm doing research or at least that I'm following the threads. And well, I was thinking about what to do and I decided to present myself and to say that I'm an anthropologist doing research on the meanings of political self-harm actions among young people. And well, for me, it was a great decision to do that. And for them, it was like, oh, okay, no problem. I don't know if it's because an anthropologist is like, well, she's not a psychologist. Come here. But this moment for me is important because I think, well, now the discussion is not going to be in the same sense because I'm there and they know that I'm there. But at the end, I think that I have this in moral terms. I have to explicitly say that I'm following these threads. And I'm also going to this question that you posted out in one of the slides. And this, when does the fieldwork end when you are doing fieldwork online? And for me, it was really difficult too, because you connect with the people that you are following and you are sharing and you are also saying things when they are interacting. And it was more difficult for me than for them, to be honest, because once I have to finish because I had a grant for doing my PhD and I said, it's enough, I have to finish, I have to write. And for me, it was more difficult than for them. Okay, no problem. Thank you. You can give us the information. I also present the thesis to them. But it was more difficult for me than for them. It's just a reflection on that.
Yeah, because you engage differently with them, right? It was so also, I mean, what we consider data, right? We read often, and we really, it becomes a part of us as well.
Yeah, and the experiences that they share.
Yeah,
were really
touching. Yeah. There's something called mirror neurons. Have you heard about mirror neurons? No. So mirror neurons, the theory of mirror neurons, it's about people. So when you see something, when you read something, especially with reading, this comes forward, your mind creates the neural pathways as if this were happening to you.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's why reading is so important, and what we read, because it's really, our body is living through that experience. And the more deeply you do it, and as a researcher, you do it very deeply, then like your brain actually forms the same experience in your mind as if you live it.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's why it was so touching and so difficult. But you also touched upon some ethical issues, right? Of what it means to step out as a lurker and introduce yourself, and is it even ethical to be a lurker and just collect data that is just online posted by people who didn't probably intend for this information to be included into research and so on. So there's lots of ethical questions there. Also the question of how to anonymize the data, the texts that were posted online. There's a beautiful text on this, which is it's in defense of falsification. So there was an example of these two researchers who used blogs as their data, and they worried that the people who wrote those blogs could be identified. So they changed certain things, and then they weren't able to publish that paper because the peer reviewers said that this is falsification. So there's a really interesting discussion here about what is good, valuable, valid data and what are ethical practices. And that is something that's there's no definite answer, right? about that. This is something that we can discuss. And so on, but it's worth thinking about it if you're collecting data. Yeah. Thank you, you've been waiting for a while.
No worries, and I had a lot of questions, so stop me when you feel like it. So I had 3 questions, I think. The first one is, I just wanted to understand better this idea of field events. And whether this is something that is broader than studying the digital, right? Are you proposing this as a way of thinking about ethnography, even in non-digital context? So I just wanted to get some clarity on that. The second thing I was thinking about is, where would studying a component of the digital that is opaque? So I look a lot at questions around algorithms, right? So people's engagement with these technologies is often mediated through digital components that they can't quite exactly understand. None of us can, right? I don't know why a platform sent me a social media feed highlighted a particular thing, right? So where in all this categorization of different types of studying the digital do you think that would fit, was another question. And a third question, a lot of what you've been saying, I've been trying to think of how unique is this to the digital versus the evolution of anthropology and ethnography as a field. So for instance, the kind of evolution of the digital ethnography and all the different terminology for it that you spoke about, part of it was about the evolution of the digital technologies themselves and ways of studying it. But I was also wondering, how does this intersect with a lot of the conversations about bringing in power and politics in anthropology in the 1990s? For instance, I'm thinking about the famous Akhil Gupta, James Ferguson discussion of what is a field, right? And ideas of this is what is seen as an appropriate field. So you study religion, you study it in India, why would you study it elsewhere? So I was just wondering what that looks like in the context of the digital. What are the appropriate things to study? Who are the appropriate people to be doing the studying? They have, in that book, they have this fascinating chapter called "Can You Take the Subway to the Field?" So this idea of, can you study something that is physically close to you? So what is the equivalent of who can't study what in the digital world is? Sorry, that's a lot of questions.
That's a lot.
Very patient.
But
Were any of them that
they're wonderful questions, yeah. I mean, the first question about what is different from face-to-face, right? Because, some of this I think could also be relevant to people who are, for example, studying at home, and are, also find it difficult to get out of the field site, for example, right? If your field site is at your home or where you work, for example, say you are a nurse or a consultant. One of my colleagues worked as a consultant and then used that as a field as well. So there, I think, yes, you can have some parallels between the digital field events and the offline field events. But I mean, with field events, I really wanted to engage with these different technologies. So that was my focus, yes, get out of the site at all. And I guess that is also related to your questions of the power and politics and so on. These are always relevant questions. But I did not foreground them that much, because for me it was more about what are the technologies doing. So indeed, that would be something that I would, I guess, need to think a bit about more further. Yeah, great question, really. But I was interested in what do different kinds of technologies enable, and how do they allow us certain things and not allow us other things. So it was more about that. That was my focus with the field events. And I would still, I wouldn't, because it is about the inclusion of technologies, I wouldn't want to use field events just for anything without the technologies. So I really want the concept, it's this, for, yeah. But for algorithms, again, I wonder, maybe a new kind of field should be used to describe that, I don't know. That is
So
a
these don't feel adequate to kind
I don't know, that would be something to think about. I'd be happy to think about with you on that further.
no, I have no thoughts, that's not.
No, but this is a process, right? Because I finished my fieldwork in 2020 on this. And the algorithms and all this AI stuff, it's just emerged now, right? I think Nick Seaver is one of the few anthropologists who is really engaging with algorithms. And I wonder, yes, what would that be? Would then an algorithm be a part of this field event between the people who are affected and the people who make them? Maybe, that's an interesting question.
And there are also boundaries to which of those you're actually allowed to study, right? So it's also opaque in the sense of the design team is not going to allow you to get close to it.
Yeah, indeed, yeah, there's a lot of power in there as well.
Okay, thank you very much for the insightful talk. And I was wondering, like about the main differences between in-person and online ethnography, because you had two field sites, one in India and another one in Oman, if I understood correctly. And then somehow the map became much larger, like I saw the world map, and then you had a lot of interlocutors in the end, when you started interviewing people online. I'm curious because traditionally anthropologists go to a field site, maybe one or two, and then they gain a really rich and deep data set. But when you have a talk with your interlocutors online, then because of the diversity of cultures and worldviews, I mean, the data you get might become, somehow thinner, in my opinion. So,
yes.
yeah, I don't know. I'm wondering how you would maybe identify these difference, this kind of difference, and yeah.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly where I was going at actually with this whole paper and presentation, because of course it is not possible to have the same kind of engagement in all those sites. So the map that you saw, that's not actually the map, the right map, right? It's a very approximate thing, really. The intensity is not the same. And that's what matters. So what I want to say is that this is something important to keep in mind when people are engaging with digital technologies. For example, I came across a scholar recently who was working with people working in the tech sector, and from all around the world, and he met them at conferences, and he had Skype interviews with them and so on. But those people, the subject that he explored was one subject, I don't know exactly what it was, I forgot. But what was striking to me was that he used all those people coming from all those different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, geographical backgrounds, with different technological structures, with different histories and approaches to technology and so on. Very different experiences, lived experiences. But in his presentation, it was all one thing. It was all brought together as a one field site, or as a one. So, and I found that very striking. So I think it's really, really important to keep those differences in mind and to make it explicit. And say, this is, I'm gathering all this information, but having the knowledge or being aware of the fact that these are not the same kind of level data that I'm collecting. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's a comment more than a question, but I was really struck by the quotation you put up on Malinowski, which were word for word the exact words that Tom uses to introduce his ethnography. He borrows from Malinowski to, I think, clarify that his approach is essentially the same. I'm in a digital environment. This digital environment is my field. And he discusses at some length how he's not concerned very much with what happens outside of that field. If people want to tell him about their lives outside, that's fine. So I think that's a kind of interesting approach, and there was some, I mean, I think that was controversial at the time when you first introduced that. Is that really anthropology if we don't know how this connects with people's offline lives? I think he satisfied that with this later research, which is kind of related to people that have particular health issues. And then he connected the offline and the online dots, and that's a very satisfying study. So yeah, I don't have a particular question about that, but I thought it was kind of an interesting observation. But is there a sort of self-contained online field? I also like the fact that you're kind of, maybe it's a little bit like Danny Miller, but you've got a field site, and of course there's all sorts of ways in which people are connecting within that field site online. So that becomes part of your study.
Yes.
And maybe that reminds me a little bit of Jenna Burrell's ethnography as well, where she looked at, was it internet cafes in Ghana and Accra? But in connection with that, the networks, she uses the concept of the network. So I guess the networks that then intersect with those in-person sort of field site analysis. So yeah, I don't think I have a question about that, but the other comment I wanted to make was about the relationship between the anthropologist and the field. Because I think digital technologies have tweaked that in very interesting ways. Just a couple of anecdotes. I was walking down Benbury Road one time with somebody who does field work amongst insurgents in Colombia, I think it is, very edgy field work, and her phone was going ping, 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 ping all the way down Benbury Road. And I said, you know, you're quite popular. Well, that's my WhatsApp groups in the Amazon, you know, feeding her data continuously. And I guess we used to have a concept. The second anecdote is a student who recently finished her doctoral research. She was looking at detox camps in California. And one of the sort of issues she encountered as an kind of anthropological issue, ethical issue, I suppose, is when she left the field, she found it hard to leave the field, actually, you know, because immediately after digital detox camp, everybody befriended her on social media. And she thought, well, I kind of want to end my field work and go back to Oxford and be away from the field, but can I do that? And it caused her some ethical dilemmas. How do I treat my participants ethically, but also step away? So I just think those are some interesting dilemmas that relate to how the anthropologist, you know, engages with the field and whether they can actually leave the field if they want to.
Also, I was thinking even the fact that your book is open access, for instance, right, and is so easily available to your interlocutors.
Yes.
What does that do to how you think about it? Very interesting.
So those are really just comments rather than questions, but thoughts.
Yeah. So it's relevant. What I would say to many.
I have one, I guess, comment, one question. The comment is, I guess I'd be curious to know, when you kind of showed it visually, and I guess it's for the audience to understand, but like that type of mapping does kind of, I guess, prioritize the spatial. And I wondered if you thought about forms of, I guess, like visual, we talk about like thinness versus thickness, and like forms of representing where like actually you have no countries on the map, but each line is the event, and the event has a certain like has a vector, which is the direction of it, but it has like kind of varying fit, like a way of showing events in like a visual language that translates it and let someone like read your data and be like, here are the, how do we show it? It's easy to show a field site. You can show a map of Accra and go, this is Accra. But like I was thinking if you thought anything about that. and the.
I haven't, but thank you.
Okay.
This is fantastic. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, like
Because
I
clearly, I mean, this visual representation of a map, it doesn't hold.
it kind of reifies the thing of then,
Yeah.
and then the question, I guess, which is more, I guess, empirical, was you looking at, I guess, kinship, networks and caring, you could choose any group, but the group you chose are people who also engage in care for a living, and also are engaging in care and living in settings that I imagine are also undergoing shifts towards telemedicine and different types. So I guess if there were any sense of like we're talking to carers who both care in the shift, in the second shift, and some of them are digitalizing at different rates, and how that changes everything.
Yes, yes, for sure. I mean, specifically, there was one nurse who actually used telemedicine in her work. And she learned from that to take care of her parents, but she also learned from her parents to take care to work. Because I mean, she said, well, she called her parents twice a day, every day, before and after her night shift. Because she was doing night shifts, right? And then we called on the phone and she said, oh, I just saved the life. And and I said, oh my God, really? Do you need a rest? Is this a good time? And she's like, yeah, I'm fine. So she was clearly on the adrenaline. But she said the only way that this care for her parents is working is because she's calling so often, because that's crucial to maintain the trust, so that they were also listening to her advice. And it was such a striking example, because she also had two sisters. So this one, she lived in the US, but one sister was a nurse in the Middle East, in Bahrain, I think. And the other one lived down the road, was married down the road. And yet the person who was the furthest away had the most contact with them, and they also listened to her advice the most. And, you know, when things, also when the mother had a stroke, this nurse took holiday, like a break, and came home to take care of it and so on. So she said that this was very important. So she was really the one who made it clear to me that the frequency mattered. And that was also then, later I wrote a paper on the lessons from this field work for telemedicine.
That's what I was gonna ask,
Yeah, there's a paper.
Okay.
And it's one of those things, it's like, it's important to build trust. And this is how it's done, by engaging with people.
Listening to your fascinating talk, it made me think about the disruptions of time as well as space. Not only the online and the offline, but all of your discussion about different time zones and how you thought your field work was ending at 11 o'clock. And then the Skype rings and you're on again, or people are walking down Banbury Road and things happening in a different time zone. It's coming into your life then, and then juggling the time zones in the calls and so forth. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about that also in terms of labor and time, because of the work of juggling the time zones and never being free, and doing it before or after other episodes of employment.
Absolutely, I mean, it's a very, but even, it's a very intense experience, for sure. But I think field work always is, even without it, even if you are in field, you go somewhere, I mean, you can also be, I don't know, there were examples of doing field work with police in the US, at all times of day. And then typing field notes, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. I think that there is certain intensity to all kinds of field work. And then this kind of like working with technologies has some specificity to it. But I mean, when you are, it's both intense in terms of that sometimes you are completely at the service of your field. And then other times you're also at the service when nothing is happening. And it's hugely frustrating. So I mean, there's a big emotional spectrum that goes into that as well. Yeah, it is tough work.
People might be interested in an article that was recently published by, I recently finished his PhD here, somebody called Akita Shah. He published it in the Journal of the Anthropological Society here in Oxford, which is online. But his situation was he was doing his field work in Japan on, I think it was a baccalaureate degree or something. And of course, the whole thing was shut down by COVID. And luckily, he was able to readapt it for online, but he has a really interesting article about the subjectivity of being up all night. Trapped in his college here, St. Anthony's as it happens, and up all night, doing field work, and it took 6 months for his biorhythms to sort of return to normal afterwards. So people who are interested in the kind of subjective experience of extreme online field work, might be interested in that.
I think it might be done.
Oh, yeah, sorry. We have reached the end, I think, of our time. So let me move it to. Just a reminder that we do have one more talk in week 6, and the Davies is going to be talking about Nigeria.
Digital archiving and the telling of specific history of Nigeria online.
Okay, thank you. And also, we will be going around the corner to the Rose and Crown for drinking to continue the conversation a little bit more informally. Anybody who wishes to join us, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Questions.